myself a skeptical person, someone who doesn't get easily scared. But after that night, I realized that fear doesn't need logical explanations. It just needs a place. And that night, the place was an abandoned garage. This happened about 2 years ago when I moved to a more distant neighborhood in the city. The rent was cheap, and the neighborhood seemed quiet, albeit a bit deserted. There were many old houses and abandoned buildings around, which gave the area a somewhat melancholic air. One of those buildings was a mechanic's garage located 3 blocks from my house. The place had been closed for years, with no trespassing signs hanging on all sides. They said the owner had vanished suddenly, but nobody knew why. I never worried about it until I had to pass by there one night. I was working late that day and ended up taking a bus that dropped me off at a farther stop than usual. This meant I would need to walk through the block where the garage was located. It was something I avoided because the place had a strange vibe. During the day, it just looked like an abandoned building, but at night, it was different. The air felt heavier around it, and the shadows of nearby trees seemed to stretch toward it. When I got off the bus, it was already past 10 p.m. The street was completely deserted, and the silence was only broken by the distant sound of a barking dog. As I approached the garage, I began to feel a slight discomfort, but I tried to ignore it. After all, it was just an old building, right? When I passed the main entrance, I noticed that one of the iron doors was ajar. This bothered me because I was sure it had been closed the last time I passed by. Maybe it was just the wind, I thought. I continued walking, but I couldn't help but take a peek inside. The streetlight was dim, but I could see enough to notice that the place was even more dilapidated inside. There were rusty cars, tools scattered on the floor, and a strong smell of old oil mixed with something I couldn't identify. But what really made me stop was the sound. A faint noise of something being dragged. It was subtle, but enough to make me freeze. I should have kept walking. I should have ignored it and gone home. But curiosity, or maybe anxiety, made me take another step toward the door. I called out, "Is anyone there?" My voice sounded louder than I expected, echoing inside the empty building. There was no response. Reason told me to leave, but something inside me made me step in. I took out my phone and turned on the flashlight, illuminating the space in front of me. The flickering light revealed the interior of the garage, with its dark corners and accumulated dust. It was as if time had stopped in there. I continued walking slowly, each step making the concrete floor creak beneath my feet. The sound of something being dragged returned, this time louder, coming from a dark corner at the back of the garage. I pointed the flashlight in that direction, but all I saw were shadows. "If anyone is here, I don't want any trouble," I said, my voice trembling more than I wanted to admit. Then I saw something that made me want to run. On the floor, there were recent scratch marks, as if something heavy had been dragged across the concrete. The marks led to a door at the back, which seemed to lead to the basement. For some reason, I was paralyzed, unable to move. Suddenly, I heard a sound behind me. I turned quickly, shining the flashlight around, but there was nothing. Just the emptiness and the echo of my own heavy breathing. But when I turned back to the basement door, it was open. I was sure it had been closed seconds before. A chill ran down my spine. Something was wrong, very wrong. But instead of running away, I took a few more steps toward the open door. Curiosity had already turned into an almost paralyzing fear, but something compelled me to continue. I pointed the flashlight inside and saw a narrow staircase leading down into the darkness. The smell was unbearable now, a mix of burnt oil and something rotten, like decomposing meat. It was then that I heard it. A low, hoarse laugh coming from down below. My whole body froze. That was not a normal laugh. It sounded wrong, as if someone was trying to imitate a human sound and failing miserably. I decided I had already gone too far. I turned on my heels and started running for the exit. But before I could reach it, I heard footsteps behind me, quick, as if someone was running to catch up with me. I reached the door and looked back, but there was no one. Just the sound of footsteps, which stopped suddenly, as if they had never existed. I left the garage and ran down the street until I got home. I locked all the doors and windows, feeling foolish for having entered that place. But what happened next was even worse. That night, as I tried to sleep, I heard something coming from the kitchen. I thought it was my imagination, but the sound continued. A slight dragging, like what I heard in the garage. I gathered my courage and went there, but there was nothing, just the refrigerator door, which was slightly ajar. Since that night, I avoid passing by the garage, but something has changed. Sometimes I feel like I'm being watched in my own home. The sound of something being dragged still echoes in my mind, especially in the silence of the night. And the worst part? No matter how many times I lock my door, I always wake up with it slightly open. Report 2. I should have heeded the warnings. Everyone in the neighborhood knew that the abandoned garage on the main street was a place no one dared to enter. They said strange things happened inside, but I always thought they were just stories to scare children. Until one night, out of pure curiosity, I decided to find out for myself. The garage was located in a secluded area on the outskirts of the neighborhood where I grew up. It was an old building with broken windows and rusted doors that creaked in the wind. During the day, it was just another abandoned structure, but at night, there was something about it that made the air feel colder. The locals said the former owner had disappeared years ago, leaving everything behind: tools, unfinished cars, and even his personal life. The place had been shut since then, but the rumors of strange noises and flickering lights inside never ceased. One night, coming home from a party, I passed by the garage, and something caught my attention. One of the lights inside was on. It shouldn't have been. I decided to check it out. Maybe it was someone using the place as a shelter, or perhaps some vandal. I wanted to know the truth. The main door was slightly ajar. I pushed it slowly, and it opened with a loud creak that echoed through the garage. The smell inside was a mix of old oil and rust with something else. A strange metallic odor I couldn't identify. The light I saw from outside was dimmer than I expected, almost flickering, casting shadows in every direction. Inside, the place was exactly as people described. Tools scattered about, dismantled cars covered in dust, and boxes stacked in a corner. The silence was almost absolute, except for the occasional sound of dripping water. I looked around, trying to find any clues of who might be there. That's when I noticed something strange. On the floor there were drag marks, as if something heavy had been moved recently. The marks led to a large workbench at the back of the garage, where a huge tarp covered something bulky. My heart began to race. What was under that tarp? Against my better judgment, I decided to find out. I walked slowly toward the workbench, each step echoing in the empty space. When I got closer, I noticed the tarp was stained with something that looked like oil, or maybe blood. I carefully pulled the tarp aside, and what I saw made my stomach churn. It was a human mannequin, but not like the ones you see in stores. It was grotesquely modified, with parts sewn together as if someone had used pieces from different dolls to assemble it. The face was the most disturbing. It had glass eyes that seemed to follow my movements and a hand-drawn mouth with teeth made of metal. As I tried to process what I was seeing, I heard a sound behind me. It was a soft click, like a tool being adjusted. I turned quickly, but there was no one there, just the growing feeling that I was no longer alone. The light began to flicker faster, and the sound of something scraping against the concrete echoed through the space. I turned back to the workbench and noticed that the mannequin was different. Its head, which had been tilted down, was now facing directly at me. My body froze. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but before I could do anything, I heard footsteps, slow footsteps, coming from somewhere deeper in the garage. Someone was there. It was no longer a matter of what if. My mind went into panic. I decided to leave, but when I turned to run, the door I had entered was closed. I didn't remember closing it. I started to walk quickly to the side door I had seen when I entered, but the footsteps behind me were getting louder, faster. Before I could reach the door, something fell to the ground with a crash. I looked back and saw that one of the boxes had been knocked over. Tools were scattered across the floor, but there was no one in sight. Just the sound of my own ragged breathing and the oppressive silence. Finally, I reached the side door and pushed it open hard, stepping out into the cold night air. I ran without looking back, straight to my house. My heart felt like it was going to explode, and my hands trembled so much that I could barely turn the key in the lock. That night, I could barely sleep. I sat in the living room with all the lights on, trying to forget what I had seen. But the worst part came the next morning. When I woke up, I found something on my porch. It was a small piece of tarp, stained with oil or blood. I don't know who or what was in that garage, but I know that somehow they know I was there. Since then, I avoid passing by that street, but sometimes in the silence of the night, I feel like I'm still being watched. 3. Account. When I lost my job, I accepted any work that came my way. So when I was offered the chance to fix some cars in an abandoned garage for good money, I accepted without thinking twice. But that night, while working alone, I realized that the place had something more than just dust and old cars. The garage was located on the outskirts of the city, an old, decaying building that seemed to have seen no life in decades. The owner was a strange guy who only gave me basic instructions and then disappeared. He said he needed me to do some quick repairs on 3 cars that were inside and that payment would be made the next day. It seemed easy enough, so I didn't ask any questions. I arrived at the location around 6 p.m. with the sun already starting to set. The garage was bigger than I had imagined, filled with old tools, car parts, and the smell of old oil. The 3 vehicles were parked at the back, covered with tarps. The silence was almost complete, except for the distant sound of cars passing on the nearby road. I started working on the first car immediately, thinking I would finish everything in a few hours. As I disassembled the engine, I began to notice strange things. First, it was the garage door, which had been open when I arrived, but was now completely closed. I thought it was the wind, even though there was no draft. Then I started hearing sounds, light footsteps and scratching coming from somewhere in the building. At first, I ignored it, thinking it might be rats or cats. But the sounds grew louder, more insistent. I continued to work, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But then, while adjusting a part, I heard a noise behind me. It was the sound of something falling, as if a tool had been dropped. I turned quickly and saw a wrench on the floor. The problem was that I knew I hadn't taken that tool off the workbench. My heart began to race. I looked around, but there was no one there. The garage was lit only by an old lamp hanging from the ceiling, which swayed slightly, casting shadows on the walls. I took a deep breath and tried to get back to work, but my concentration was completely shattered. When I finally finished the first car, I looked at the clock. It was almost 11 p.m. I was exhausted, but I needed to finish the other 2. I went to the second car and pulled back the tarp, revealing an old vehicle covered in dust. As I illuminated the interior with my flashlight, I felt a chill run down my spine. On the driver's seat, there was something written with a finger in the dust on the glass. 3 words, "You can't leave." My hands began to tremble. I tried to wipe away the words with my hand, but the dust seemed untouched. I stepped back from the car, looking around. That's when I realized the sound of footsteps was closer now. The feeling of being watched was almost suffocating. I decided enough was enough and started gathering my tools to leave. As I was packing everything up, I heard a sound that made me freeze. It was a low, hoarse laugh, as if someone was trying to stifle their laughter. It came from somewhere in the back of the garage. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it in the direction of the sound, but I only saw shadows and the two remaining cars. The laughter stopped, but now I could hear heavy footsteps coming towards me. I didn't wait to find out who or what was there. I ran to the main door, but it was locked. I couldn't remember closing it. I went to a side door I had seen earlier, but it wouldn't open either. The sound of footsteps was getting closer, and I could feel my heart pounding in my throat. That's when I heard a whispered voice, as if it were right next to me. "You shouldn't be here." My mind was in a panic. I ran to the back of the garage where there was a broken window. I pushed the shards of glass out and squeezed through the tight space, cutting my arm in the process. As soon as I was outside, I started running without looking back. I got home trembling, breathless, and with the cut on my arm bleeding. I tried to call the owner of the garage to tell him I wouldn't be back, but the call never went through. It was as if the number didn't exist. The next day, I returned to the garage during the day to get my tools. When I arrived, the place looked different. The door was locked with rusty padlocks, and it seemed like no one had been there in years. I asked a neighbor about the place, and he looked at me with a confused expression. "No one has worked in that garage since the owner disappeared over 20 years ago," he said. To this day, I don't know who or what was in that garage with me that night. But I know I should never have taken that job. Something was waiting for me inside, and somehow made it clear that I should never come back.